So there's 5 methods of appraisement, and they are transaction value is the first one. It's the most common. It's what was actually paid for the goods. And that's the one that generally gets used for most entries. The next method is transaction value of identical merchandise. So it's very similar to transaction value, but if there's a situation where let's say there wasn't a transaction, something was shipped for free, or it could be a scenario where you can't determine the value, or perhaps there are it's a situation where you're precluded from using transaction value. And in the regulations, we'll look at this in a minute. There's stipulations on scenarios where you can and can't use transaction value. So if you can't use transaction value, then you're going to use transaction value of identical merchandise, which basically what you're looking at is the same exact product in a different transaction, coming from the same shipper to the ideally the same purchaser, but at least the same shipper to the same country around the same time frame. And then you can use the transaction value from that purchase. And if that doesn't meet the requirements, then you move on to transaction value of similar merchandise, which is basically the same as identical merchandise. If you read the regulations in these 2 sections, they're almost word for word exact. So it's kind of confusing. It trips a lot of people up. The way I like to think about it, helps me separate it, is identical merchandise. It's the same exact product. Similar merchandise is it's commercially interchangeable, but maybe not the exact same product. So just to use a simple example to drive that point home, think about batteries, right? So let's look at AA batteries. There's a bunch of different manufacturers of AA batteries. You can have Energizer, you can have Duracell. There's many different manufacturers. So if somebody was shipping a bunch of AA Energizer batteries, but they were shipped free of charge, so you don't have a transaction value. If there was another shipment that happened for those same batteries where there was a transaction, then you could use transaction value of identical merchandise. There's still those same AA Energizer batteries. But if you have a scenario where there was no other AA Energizer batteries shipped, but there were AA Duracell batteries, that would be transaction value of similar merchandise using that one. Okay, so just identical, it's the exact same product. Similar, it's commercially interchangeable. It's the same thing, it'll work, it's interchangeable, but it's not the exact same product. Next, we have deductive value. And under deductive value, you would use this if, I'm not sure if I mentioned this in the beginning, you apply the methods of transaction value in order. So you always start with transaction value. If you can't use transaction value, you move on to transaction value of identical merchandise. If that doesn't work, you move to similar merchandise. If you can't use that, then you move on to deductive value. So deductive value, you're taking the price of the good after it's sold. So like those batteries come into the United States, we can't apply any of the previous 3 methods. So we would take the selling price when the batteries were sold in the US, and then you back out charges that are outlined in the regulations to arrive at an acceptable entered value to report to customs. And then computed value, if you can't use deductive value, you'd move on to computed value. And computed value is you start at the beginning. You start with raw materials, the manufacturing process, and you build up the value from there. And computed value can't be used. Then the last method of appraisement is any means by which customs can determine the value. So if you get to really, if you end up past transaction value, you're probably going to be having conversations about how to properly determine the value of these goods. If you make it to method 6, it's because none of the other methods were able to determine an acceptable value to report to customs. Then the importer would ask customs, please help us determine a value. None of the methods are working. We don't have enough information. And then customs will apply a combination of all available methods and accepted accounting principles to determine a value for those goods. So the last method is basically importer can't figure it out. They ask customs for help, and then they're going to determine the value. So those are the methods of appraisement. They get applied in order, and a majority of the test is going to focus on transaction value. And that's where we're going to focus most of our time is on transaction value. When you're dealing with calculations, things like that, it's typically all under transaction value. Questions on the other methods of appraisement generally stick with which method of appraisement would be appropriate in this scenario, and we have a question we're going to look at like that tonight. Or it could be transaction value can't be used. Which method would you use in this scenario? So I haven't yet, of all of the exams that we've been through and questions we've reviewed and logged, I haven't seen anywhere you actually have to use deductive value and calculate the entered value. So don't worry about that. You just need to know what the different types of valuation are and when you would apply them.